Well, you may be wondering how you get authority. Can you ask for it? Can you have somebody just simply lay hands on you and give it to you? Well, the answer is yes and no. Asking for authority is a little bit like asking for patience. God doesn't give you patience, He gives you tests. But then once you master those tests, it leads to greater patience. Asking God for more authority is a good starting point. At least you recognize the need for it in your life. But ultimately, what you're asking for is more authority, and what does that lead to? Well, I think it leads to what I call the crescendo of obedience. What do I mean by that? It just simply means you start with small acts of obedience, they grow to larger acts of obedience. God will ask you to do something. You'll obey, and then He'll ask you to do something a little bit harder. You'll obey, and then He'll ask you to do something a little bit harder, and you'll obey Him again. See, this is what the crescendo is. It brings you closer to God because your obedience brings relationship. Conversely, disobedience separates us from a relationship with God, and without relationship, we have no authority. It's this kind of obedience to God that generates relationship, and relationship releases authority. This is how it happened with Jesus. He learned obedience through the things that He suffered. That's interesting because Jesus had to learn obedience. That tells us that it's not a sin to have to learn to be obedient. There's a certain amount of grace to walk out this process of obedience with God. You're not going to gain the kind of authority that makes demons shriek as you walk by overnight. It takes some time. You're going to gain what I call relational authority through this crescendo of obedience, starting with doing the small things He asks you to do, such as prayer, for example. See, even when you think there's no time to pray, pray anyway if God's asking you to do it. Your test of obedience just might be to learn to trust more in the value of prayer than in the value of what you're doing that you feel you won't get done if you take time to pray. Perhaps obedience was behind Jesus continually saying that He did only what He saw the Father doing. Jesus did nothing if the Father was not doing it. So authority comes through obedience. Obedience comes through relationship, and relationship takes time. I have many young leaders that come to me and ask me if there's a shortcut to this process, and I tell them, yeah, absolutely there's a shortcut. All God does is He takes all those trials and He crams it into a shorter amount of time. So you don't have any hurdles removed from you. You just take the hurdles that were this far apart, and now you put them this far apart. So in a shorter period of time, you go through more tests. And one of the big tests God is taking many through today involves the whole idea of emotional pain. There's developing in this country what I call a pain avoidance teaching. This doctrine says that since God is love, He would never want us to experience pain. Overcoming pain is one of the things that makes God justified in promoting us. It's what justifies Him giving us authority over the enemy. It's not that God gives us the pain, it's that we overcome the enemy who wants to instill that pain. There's another reason a pain avoidance teaching in the church today really bothers me, and it's because it's a slap in the face to the martyrs that the world is now starting to see once again. These people selflessly risk death to worship God or even to own a Bible. I remember hearing a story of a pastor in China who was told by an American pastor that his church was praying for them, specifically that the persecution of the underground church in China would end. The Chinese pastor responded to that pastor by saying something very, very strange. He said this, "Please don't pray for persecution in my country to come to an end. Persecution is the very thing that's keeping the underground church in China alive. My biggest fear is that persecution would end and we would become like the church in America, apathetic and feeling we're entitled." God doesn't take us through times of pain and trials to punish us. That's not what we're saying here. That's not His intent at all. In God's system of perfect justice, He becomes justified in giving us authority when we overcome the attacks of the enemy. We overcome those attacks by listening to God and doing what He asks us to do, obedience. We do overcome all of this, but we don't overcome it in our own strength. We overcome it because we are obedient to God, and He tells us how to overcome and how to be more than a conqueror. Coffee.